and welcome back to another episode. In this video, I want to go over the legacy somewhat of Ernesto Che Guevara. Now, to many people out there who wear Che t-shirts and have Che posters, to these people and to various celebrities, politicians, and even some intellectuals, Che is kind of a symbol of social justice and revolution. But in this video, I just wanted to kind of take a look at Che and expose him as being the psychotic, racist, homophobic killer that he actually was, and that in this way he should not be venerated at all. And the first point I want to make, and that kind of leads into everything that's about to come, is that Che Guevara was a psychopath. Now, a psychopath or a sociopath, what they have in common is an extreme lack of empathy with other people or things. And this can cause them to do seemingly outrageous things that you just don't do in a civilized society. And when you see what young Che did, you can kind of see this very early on. So example, lack of empathy. But when he was a child, he actually enjoyed torturing animals. And that is one of the key indicators of potentially psychotic or sociopathic behavior later on in life. He was also a rapist, and he even had a nickname of being the Red Rooster because he was so quick in how he would rape young women. And one of the accounts that was actually recorded, his family was actually quite well off, and he had servants. And one time, when he was still a teenager, but a young teenager, 14 or 15, I guess, they were actually seated at the dinner table, and right in the middle of dinner, in front of his friends, he threw one of the female servants onto the table, raped her quickly in front of his friends, and then sat back down like nothing happened. Again, only a psychopath can do this. He had no empathy for the young woman that he did this to, and he just didn't care. But this is also kind of part of his magnetism too, and that people who kind of buck the norms we can sometimes be drawn to them, even though it may be wrong to do so. And this was definitely Che. It's hard to I am going to speculate on why he was this way. And throughout his young life, Che's father was definitely distant from him. Like I said, the family was very well off, but throughout his life, it was various business issues caused the family fortune to ebb somewhat. But nonetheless, they still try to kind of keep on the airs of being a very successful and wealthy family. And this put a lot of pressure on the father and caused him to withdraw. And typically, young men need fathers to show them how to be men and to show empathy to others. But Che simply didn't have this. He was largely raised by his mother and by servants. And I think this is where his psychopathic behavior came from. Now, Che Guevara was also a racist. To me, this is very clear. But I'm just going to throw up some quotes that Che was known to have said. "We're going to do for blacks exactly what blacks did for the revolution, by which I mean nothing. The Negro is indolent and lazy, and spends his money on frivolities, whereas the European is forward-looking, organized, and intelligent. Mexicans are a band of illiterate Indians." And these are all quotes that Che used, and there are other ones as well. Now, if you look online, sometimes Che's defenders will try and defend him in a couple of ways. One, he'll say that he said these things when he was young, and that his ideas changed as he grew older. The other is that they'll point out that he often spoke in favor of particularly black liberation in various venues later on, in particular in the United Nations. My take on that is that Che was very much an opportunist, and that he was all about radical Marxist revolution and whatever he had to say to get towards that goal, he would say. So if he was going to speak in favor of black revolution, from imperialism in the UN, he would definitely do that, but it was only as a means to an end. What would happen though is, as he was actually quite an incompetent military commander, and even he admitted it, and his revolutions outside of Cuba were all failures, what he would do is he would not take this blame on himself, but he would blame the people who he was, in theory, trying to liberate, whether they be blacks or Mexicans or anybody else. Again, for Che, my reading of the man is that he was all in it for the glory and for the revolution, and if he could do that by saying racist things, he would. If saying anti-racist things, but that would help him get there, he would say that too. But in the end, these statements, I think, stand for themselves. Now we come to the Cuban Revolution, which is obviously the key point in Che's life. And what happened was, on November 25th, 1956, he set sail with the Castro brothers to overthrow Batista's government. And Batista, obviously, I have to point out, was not George Washington, let's say. He was definitely an authoritarian, and he ran a vast secret police force to hold on to power. At this time, Cuba was definitely not a democracy, and the Castro brothers were promising people democracy when they attempted the revolution. Nonetheless, it should be pointed out, though, that Cuba, relative to other countries at that time, was actually quite prosperous, and it actually had higher average wages than Belgium, Denmark, France, or Germany. And of course, when Castro took power, that ended pretty quickly. But the key thing to understand as far as Che goes, and why he is so revered by so many, is that Castro's battle for Cuba was largely a public relations campaign. After the revolution was done, supposedly this fight went on for close to 2 years, but when it was all said and done, only 183 people died on both sides during the entire revolution. And again, that's also because Fidel himself was not a great military commander. But what he was great at, though, was propaganda and just general politics. And what Fidel did, is he set up this thing called the Miami Pact, which is basically a coalition of anti-Batista politicians and businessmen, particularly located in Florida and Miami. And he got money from them, and he used these to buy stories that were pro-revolution, that ran in like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and kind of made it look like he was winning battle after battle. And also he used this money to buy off individual commanders in Batista's army. The British historian Hugh Thomas wrote that, in all essentials, Castro's battle for Cuba was a public relations campaign fought in New York and Washington. And it just kind of shows you what can be done with propaganda, because on the one hand, due to his propaganda, the United States withdrew all support of the Batista regime, and then Batista himself wasn't sure which commanders he could trust because Castro was essentially buying them off. And this is why they won the revolution. Batista fled the country, and on January 1st, 1959, the revolution was over. Now, of course, Fidel Castro, the Castro brothers, and Che Guevara promised democracy and freedom and end to the secret police, etc., but this is not what occurred, and Cuba was declared a Marxist-Leninist state 4 years later. Now, like I said in the beginning to this video, Che Guevara was a cold-blooded killer, and I suspect this came from a part that he was a psychopath, as I indicated when he was a child. Just one example, to kind of make it personal, is he killed a man named Eutimio Guerra, who was a rural guy who was actually helping the rebels during the Cuban Revolution, but then was charged with treachery. Now, Fidel ordered his bodyguards to kill him, but they couldn't do it I suspect largely because they weren't completely sure he was guilty, and he obviously had no trial or any such thing. But Che didn't even hesitate and just shot the man in the temple right away. Later, related to this incident, he actually wrote to his father and said, "I like to confess, Papa, at the moment I discovered that I really liked killing." And that's the reaction of a psychopath. That if you enjoy killing, you have no empathy for your killing, you're a maniac. But this was Che. He also, after the Cuban Revolution was done, he was the man who established Cuba's new secret police and also firing squads. Like I said before, Batista definitely had his secret police, but what Che set up was 100 times worse. And one thing that was, well, many things that were interesting, but is that he insisted on no blanks being used for his firing squads. And the reason for that is he wanted every person in that firing squad to know that they were guilty of killing them or of killing people. So if there was ever a counter-revolution, he wanted them to know that they would be found guilty too. And this creates a very kind of sick loyalty to the existing regime. He was known to wipe out entire families with the firing squads. And for a long time, it was actually very hard to get a take on just how many people were killed by the secret police by Che's firing squads. Because what they would do is before they would kill someone, they would write up phony death certificates and say, "Oh, person A died of a heart attack." Then they would go and kill him, and they wouldn't allow the family to look at the body to see how he actually died. So later on, people were able to make estimates of just how many people died due to firing squads in Cuba, but for a long time it was very hard to figure that out. He also set up the first forced labor camps in Cuba, modeled after Stalin's gulags. And basically anyone who rejected the regime's ideology was sent there. And this is actually quite in thinking with Marxist ideology, that with the way Marxists think, they always have this idea of creating a new man, and a man sort of free of the weaknesses of capitalism or bourgeois society. And when you don't measure up, there must be something wrong with you, and you need to go to a re-education camp. That's why you see these popping up in China or North Korea, in Cuba, or in Soviet Russia. And in Cuba's case, is where homosexuals, eventually AIDS victims, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Afro-Cubans were often sent, among others. He also converted the La Cabana fortress into a prison where he personally executed and tortured prisoners. Again, he was a psychopath, and many of them were children. One sort of famous story was there was a 12-year-old who was brought to Che in this prison, and he tried to stop his father from being killed, and this is why he was in this prison. And people kind of wonder, well, you're not going to, the kid was trying to protect his father, surely you're going to let him go. But of course, that's not what Che did, and he shot him in the back of the head without hesitating. But that's the kind of the man that Che was. Now, eventually, the Black Book of Communism, which was an effort by academics to just get a take on the death toll in communist and Marxist societies, eventually estimated that over 14,000 people were killed by Che's firing squads in the first year, as it turns out. And as Cuba is a very small country, that would be the equivalent to 3 million people dying in the United States. So you can just see what a monster Che Guevara actually was. Now we come to this question of Che the myth. I think with my brief overview here, you can see that Che Guevara was definitely a monster. But if that's the case, why is it that today so many people, or so many celebrities wear Che t-shirts with no shame, and why the posters are of him, and why he's a symbol to even sell things like Coca-Cola. And this is where Fidel Castro comes into the picture. And the Che myth was largely manufactured by Fidel Castro, as who was a master of propaganda, in order to support his regime. The legend of Che kind of led a romantic take on the Cuban Revolution and Cuba itself, and it was Fidel who largely manufactured this myth. Just for example, John Lee Anderson, the historian John Lee Anderson, wrote what for a long time was considered the definitive take on Che's life, entitled Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life. This book was completely written under the supervision of Castro's government. And for a long time, if you wanted to write anything about Che or the Cuban Revolution, the only information you could get was from Fidel Castro's official sources. And of course, this was all slanted to create Che the myth. It was only much later that sort of the counter arguments started to come out, which exposed, in my opinion, the real Che Guevara. But what do you think? Do you think I'm right or wrong about Che? Do you even have any opinion of him, or of the celebrities who seemingly wear him on T-shirts without having any idea who he was and what he did? I'd be interested in your thoughts, so please leave them below. But other than that, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching, and until next time.